Very difficult act to follow, Howie. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank the organizers, Anna and her great group, for this wonderful conference. It's really been a great conference to be in. I've learned a lot already. So, believe it or not, Howie and I did not coordinate our presentations, and yet you will see some common topics coming across my presentation that overlap with his. So hopefully, rather than overlap each other, we'll complement and provide you with a richer picture of what we think should be this future of urban health from the health perspective and from the urban planning perspective. So what I want to do today is give you a sense of how planners can be allies in this idea of pursuing urban health towards the future. So I'm going to be more prospective and not look back so much, but look towards the future, because I think that there are great opportunities for us. And as the great rule, I will tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'll tell you, and then I'll conclude by telling you what I told you. But these are the 5 main points that I want to highlight today. The first one you heard from Howie is about policy implementation. And I am going to claim that planners are uniquely positioned to help policymakers implement better policies. And I'm going to draw a very strict distinction between what policy implementation is and what policy translation or research translation into policy might be. I'm also going to highlight the importance of climate change. Planners play a unique role in both mitigating and adapting to climate change. I'm going to talk about health impact assessment and how many of the policies that we're involved in as planners have very important health impacts, and that we as a research community are still not there in terms of the evidence to support the type of recommendations that decision makers are seeking from us. The fourth one is one that didn't come up yesterday and how we talked about it, and it's road safety, where planners, I think, have a huge role, both transportation planners but also land planners, in terms of impacting how people are exposed to traffic. Pedestrians and bicyclists are exposed to moving vehicles, and the important disparities that emerge from that. And lastly, believe it or not, I think that planners also do something on a fairly routine basis that has been overlooked, and that might respond to some of the questions about causal inference that we raised yesterday. So I think something that planners do is contribute to this discussion by incorporating some of their practices into our own research work. So I'm going to elaborate on these 5 items next. The first one on policy implementation. Imagine the complete streets policy that California passed in 2008. Just recently ratified, I think, in the end of 2014, a couple of months ago. This is a policy that had a lot of input from stakeholders, advocacy groups. It's a policy that basically aims at telling Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, whenever you build a road, keep in mind all the users: pedestrians, bicyclists, people with mobility impairments, and yes, of course, drivers and freight delivery vehicles. This policy was probably drawn in Sacramento in coordination between the legislature, the advocacy groups, and probably the leadership in the California Department of Transportation. The point of implementation is that the policy is going to look very differently when it's implemented up in Del Norte in District 1, or how it's implemented down south in El Centro next to Mexico in District 11. And it's that nuance of how individuals, the engineers, the health planners, the health promoters, the urban planners, interpret policy that is at the core of policy implementation. This is the purview of planners and policymakers. So what do we do with our research? We've heard about translation at this meeting, and so we certainly do very well with the research side. We translate our research findings and make policy recommendations. But I contend that policy implementation is the next step. For example, what determines whether policies are implemented well? And by implemented well, I mean with high fidelity to the intent and the need, and with very little slippage. We heard yesterday about a potential hypothesis that this collective action model may be a critical explanation to how policy implementation happens well or not. What strategies can practitioners and policymakers apply to improve policy implementation? And how can advocates monitor or increase the quality of policy implementation? These are all very important questions because they go to the heart at what policies are achieving and what they're not achieving. Stopping at translation, hence, is not going to be enough. Some examples from the planning world, but not exclusively from the planning world, of how this focus on policy implementation is important. So we have national physical activity plans that have been recommending state plans, and now we have the emergence of LPAPs, local physical activity plans. But a plan is useless if it's not implemented. And the point is, well, how are we going to go from that plan to action? And how do we make sure that those items identified in the plan are going to be actionable and are going to be implemented? Complete streets, I use the California Department of Transportation example just because it's one of the better examples. 28 states have passed complete streets policies, and I would say unabashedly they've been failures. With notable exceptions, they've been failures. And implementation is at the heart of those failures. But we also have local greenways plans. We talked about great intervention, curing violence. I'd imagine that implementation plays a huge role in how successful or unsuccessful some of these policies might be. And on the urban planning side, we have a number of different policies that also hinge on a lot of what planners decide. You could replace in this slide the word planner for the word county health department employee. And ultimately, what we do on the ground with the communities determines the policy implementation. We have a lot of discretion to interpret policy. We dispense applicability. We provide some guidance to individuals, to the community. We could direct resources, and we certainly are in touch with a number of different parts of the local bureaucracy. Police, fire, public works, engineering, parks and rec, and so on. This is the unique position that practitioners are in that help us researchers understand how implementation matters, and that certainly helps policymakers implement more successful policies. So I've outlined, I think, the instrumental role that planners, but really it's more local employees, what some political scientists would call street-level bureaucrats, in implementing policies and determining the success of many of those policies that we draw as researchers and that we recommend as researchers. Let me move to the second area where I think planning can play a very important role in impacting urban health towards the future. Howie, thank you for mentioning climate change. Certainly on the mitigation side, cities play a huge role. 70% of all the fossil fuel CO2 emissions come from cities. These are mostly from transportation, how we move around, but not exclusively. Depending on what city you are, your latitude and your level of income, heating and cooling also contribute to those CO2 emissions. So how we build cities will have a huge impact on our mitigation plans. But we also play a big role from the planning side on adaptation. The figures that I have up here, or this map, suggest that by the year 2100, between 130 to 200 million people, that's 2 to 3% of the global population, will be living in areas that flood regularly. And these are mostly in cities. This is a density map that ultimately suggests that Asian countries, Asian cities, are the ones that are going to be disproportionately impacted by this regular flooding. Governmental action to deal with mitigation and adaptation will necessarily have to consider urban planning. We'll have to reshape our cities. California is probably at the forefront of dealing with climate change actions, and at the core of their mitigation and their adaptation strategies is the reshaping of cities. Ultimately, the discussion, if you follow the media over the last 3 weeks, is are we going to ask people not to drive at all, or are we going to reshape our cities? And the answer from California thus far has been, let's focus on urban form. Of course, those decisions about reshaping cities have huge impacts on urban health and on the disparities of urban health. So climate change is going to be a big impetus, a big motivator for bringing planning and health together towards the future. And I mentioned the impacts of planning policies, of reshaping urban spaces on health. And I think that my third strategy here, in which planning could be very present, is in contributing to understanding those health impacts in a variety of different ways. I would contend that in some cases, planning could contribute some data. In other cases, planning could help communicate some of those impacts to the community. There are groups of planners. Within planning, we have community development planners that work very closely with the community and that could help translate some of those impacts of proposed actions to the community so that we get the feedback to decision makers. We also have a paucity of evidence that is very important to support health impact assessments. It's kind of strengthening the health piece of health in all policies. Right now, we don't have good evidence about those response relationships on some of the basic behaviors. For example, how much do people walk in different environments? The evidence to date is fairly spotty and very binary, walkable versus non-walkable. That's not that helpful for decision makers. And as I mentioned in the bottom here, the communication piece is one that also positions planners close to the community. So going back to the community with the expected impacts that researchers and others identify, other community members, community groups, is going to be important for health impact assessment. I take a little detour here to highlight some of the opportunities that also arise from planning data. This is kind of a tie-in with what we heard yesterday. We're seeing the fast emergence of spatially aware data. In this case, you see a map here with 3 different sets of dots. The red set of dots on the top is a user that is on a bicycle. Then the person walked, and those are the pink little dots. And then the person took a bus, and those are the blue dots. Planners can help us understand the behaviors by bringing contextual data. In this case, where parks are located, where residential areas are located, where perhaps office or institutional areas are located. But planners could also provide information by opening up, if you will, the Pandora's box of building permits. Those are online. They are not as fast, they're not as big as the big data we heard yesterday, but they are important in understanding where there's building activity and how are people reacting to or attracted to the extra development that's occurring. Land use information, unfortunately I must say, there's some planners here, we override our data. Those of you that are in the GIS world, we just have a new land use data, our new land use in our community. Erase the old one. We never archive it. So we can never look back to say, how have we changed? How were things in 2000? How are things in 2005? And there's a great opportunity for us to be able to do some of that work, thinking about research, thinking about the questions that we want to answer. And this data is wonderful also because it helps us improve exposure assessment. So I'm going back to the health impacts to be able to understand some of these trade-offs. So if I have my map here, I'm able to superimpose perhaps the plume of a particulate matter from automobiles and roads and get a sense of how am I exposed to some of these areas. Why is this important? Well, take a classic corridor. This is a natural corridor west of Raleigh in North Carolina. Suburban, not very walkable, not very inviting. This is very auto-oriented in my book. What's happening with this corridor? There's a motivation to redevelop it. This happens in cities. This could be a brownfield and might look a little more gritty, more urban, but the idea is the same. And we have a wonderful group of urban designers and architects come and propose something like this. Great images. Now, let me highlight here, importantly, that there is never any talk about equity and housing affordability. Very, very important at the heart at health and economic opportunity disparities. But putting those aside, very important, putting them aside, what I see here is perhaps more vehicular traffic, perhaps the same amount, maybe a little less. But these are vehicles that are going to be going slower, are going to be stopping and going more, probably, at least in the short run, emitting more pollutants. I see great tree canopy. It's very aesthetically pleasing. The tree canopy will protect the pedestrians and even the local climate area from heat island effects during the day by providing shade, but can also probably trap heat during the night, so nocturnal heat is probably going to rise. I see more pedestrians. They're walking more, their inhalation rates are going up, and they're exposed to some of these emissions that are happening. There's probably also more interactions between pedestrians and vehicles. Not bad, but all of these competing risks are present now in these types of proposals. And when you talk to a council member, and when you talk to a neighborhood, when you talk to a local business, be them, if they are pro or against this type of development, they want to hear what those impacts are. And our health impact assessments currently just tell you, I think it's going to be better, or I think it's going to be worse. Important to start the conversation, no doubt. Important to activate the community. But I think we need to go a step further in assessing these competing risks. The fourth element that I want to highlight was sorely absent from our discussions yesterday, particularly because it's one of the two pillars of the de Blasio administration, Vision Zero. It's affordable housing and Vision Zero. And we didn't hear much about road safety yesterday, and Howie, thank you for bringing it up again. But I think planning is critical to improving particularly pedestrian and bicycle-related road safety. This is as much a purview of planning and transportation engineering as it is of public health. This graph, of course, suggests that calming traffic is very important, but as I had mentioned to some of you, there's also huge inequities and disparities with respect to who's dying where, particularly in developing cities. Those dying are low-income individuals. Where are they dying? They're dying in high-income areas where the cars are going fast. So huge challenges for the future of urban health. And let me do a quick reflection here as I wrap up my talk. Someone yesterday mentioned or used the term insidious ordinariness, and I thought it was great. It was great because it reflected, in this context, what I'm feeling about vehicles. They have become so ordinary, automobiles, in our life. In just 100 years, backtrack to 1915, just the automobile was just penetrating American cities. In 100 years, vehicles have become insidious, they're everywhere, and ordinary. We don't even pay attention to the choices that involve vehicle use. And I would surmise that maybe 100 years from now, our great-great-great-grandchildren will look back at how our cities are designed today and marvel in dismay at the fact that we were concerned about letting our children go out the street because they were going to hit, maybe they could be hit by a block that is 1 ton, a metal block that is 1 ton. Traffic safety, we're going to look back and say, what were we thinking? This is absolutely crazy. There are some changes that are coming up with vehicles in the short run that are really important for urban health. The first one is the death of vehicle ownership and the rise of shared vehicles, sort of the sharing economy. This is particularly important for urban areas. BMW has strategically said car sharing is going to happen in cities. Suburban areas, rural areas, that's where we're going to market our vehicles, but we're going to have a division of car sharing. And it's no surprise car sharing is rising dramatically. But also automated vehicles. Those same agent-based models that we heard yesterday could be used to make inferences and give us ideas of what's going to happen if the cost of driving decreases. That's ultimately what automation does. I can do other things while I'm on the vehicle. Relax, maybe work a little, make some phone calls. The cost per unit of time is going to drop. That probably means more driving. As the cost of something drops, people are going to consume more of it. But spatially, unfortunately, it's also going to mean that our cities are going to expand more because that cost is dropping. And so here we have the dual challenge. We have great technological innovations and creating great challenges for planners and for health, for urban health. My last point has to do with improved causal inference, and this is where I am going out on a limb a little bit, but this spatial data has been wonderful in contextualizing where people are active. But unfortunately, many of us have researched this data in ways that I think muddy the waters in terms of causality. It's as if I wanted to understand why people went to the movies, and I went to the movies and asked people, why did you come to the movies? Leaving aside the people that didn't go to the movies, leaving aside the contrast, the counterfactual. And to date, a lot of our research that has used spatially aware data has ignored that contrast largely. In a stylized way, a lot of our research, observational research, because we agreed that RCTs are not feasible and in some cases not even desirable in urban areas, our observational research looks like this. I have a person to the left, and I try to match that person very closely through adjustment, through controls, with a person on the right. Those individuals are exposed to different environments, and I observe differences in behaviors and attribute those differences to the exposure. It could be more distal health outcomes, and the reasoning is the same. Or thinking longitudinally. This could be person in year 1 and in year 2. The person moved environments, perhaps, is now being exposed to different environments. Let's look at differences in behavior and health. This type of causal thinking requires heroic assumptions to be able to make strong causal statements. That was clear from yesterday. Well, let me suggest an area that planners deal with very regularly and that I think will improve, not solve, but make an improvement in thinking about causal impacts of the built environment specifically on behavior and hopefully health. And it's the idea that is unleashed by this spatially aware data. So you know what route I took. You saw that map of the breadcrumbs. Potentially, one can consider the routes that one did not take. And of course, this doesn't come from planners. Planners are helpful at using this technique. This is a classic choice problem in microeconomics. So you can look at route A, route B, or C, or D, or E. We know that the person chose route A. That's what we see in our spatially aware data. But we can also see what are the attributes of B, C, and D, and why didn't they pick those routes? The epidemiologists in the room are saying, well, this is a classic case control example, right? You have a case, the case is route A, and you have controls, route B, C, and D. And ultimately, that's what this is about. Yes, some assumptions are required if you want to make causal statements about this, but I think this moves you even closer to thinking about the impact of the environment on different routes or on different behaviors. It also has the benefit of moving us away from polygons around people's home or work. We experience the environment, for those of you that walked here, we experience the environments as lines, as corridors, as areas. It's much closer to how the environment really affects us, not these administrative boundaries that we call neighborhoods that, as a couple of posters yesterday suggested, vary dramatically from person to person. Okay, so to recap, I would say that planning could be instrumental to the future of urban health in a variety of ways. The first one is to understand, examine, and influence urban processes, the implementation of policies that result in urban processes. Certainly, they play a big role in climate change, both on the mitigation side and the adaptation side, and they can contribute to impact assessment data, but they could also contribute by connecting the community to those impacts that are being examined. They bring to the front issues of road safety and challenges, particularly in urban areas, and hopefully they could also contribute some analytical frameworks that are helpful to improve causal inference. So these are ways in which planners can contribute to the future of urban health in collaboration with health professionals and health researchers. Thank you.